Interestingly, the word Hindu is a Persian word that refers to people who live on the eastern side of the Sindh River, which is in modern-day Pakistan. And it was originally used by traders who were shipping their goods back and forth to refer to the people who lived in what's modern-day India and Pakistan. And so you don't find the word Hindu shows up in our religious literature because it was a foreigner's term for the people who practice the spirituality of ancient India. You do find in medieval literature, 1600, you do find Hindus using the word Hindu in that medieval literature. But they only use the term when they are engaging in discussion with Islam. So the Muslims began invading India within about 50 years of Muhammad's death. Like late 7th century, beginning of the 8th century. It's very early on, the first incursions into India. And that eventually became, an Islamic rule of India that lasted about 1,000 years. And so it was just Hinduism and Islam became so inexorably linked culturally. And so within medieval literature, you do find the word Hindu getting used when Hindus want to contrast themselves to Muslims who are occupying their same land. And far from it being a pleasant co-occupation, 100 million Hindus were killed during the Islamic occupation of India. It's the largest genocide in the history of the world by far. Extremely bloody, long. Hitler managed to kill 10, 12 million people in just a few years. This was a much longer period of time, near 1,000 years, but the numbers are much, much larger. And the population of the world was much smaller at that time. So the number 100 million is a huge number nowadays, but when you consider the population of the world was a fraction of what it was now, it's such a massive amount of people that were killed. So we sort of have a love-hate relationship with the word Hindu because we prefer words like Vaishnav, Shaiva, Shakta, terms which you actually find in the religious literature of ancient India to refer to various sects and various groups. At the same time, the word Hindu is a really convenient umbrella term that most people are familiar with, and so our sect, our tradition is Hindu. More specifically, it's a Vaishnava tradition. And then even more specific than that, it's the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. The Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, which means it comes from a place called Gauda Desh, which corresponds to modern-day West and East Bengal. So, I'm just going to say that again because people, somehow it's a thing, whenever I begin talking, a bunch of people walk in and they got to jump around. It's like they're testing us to see how focused we can be. We have a love-hate relationship with Hinduism. Even like the Jai Hind movement, kind of Indian nationalism, I always think it's funny that they use the term Hind, but that's not even their term. They should go back and find some Sanskrit term It's better, you know, like the BJP or something like that has more of a, it's more Sanskritized. So the term Hindu is a term used by Persian traders to refer to people who lived in the, you know, the Indic Peninsula, that upside down triangle. And the term Hindu then became used by Hindus, was not merely a foreigner's term, in the medieval period, when Hindus wanted to differentiate themselves from the Muslims who were the ruling class, who occupied India for 1,000 years and killed 100 million people. And then modern scholars who were studying Indian spirituality were familiar with Christianity, and which has somehow managed to be incredibly uniform over thousands of years. If you look at Christian belief, it's incredibly uniform. 3 billion Christians, but so much of their belief system is set in stone, and it's monolithic. And there's a reason for that. They came up with creeds early on, and those creeds have a staying power, and so everybody has allegiance to those early documents and those early ideas, and it creates a tremendous staying power and a sense of identity and a sense of shared belief. But anyway, when the early Christian Indologists were studying India, they just assumed there must be one spirituality of ancient India. And so they came up with the term Hinduism as an aegis, as an umbrella term that was used for all of the indigenous spirituality of India. The problem is that was an assumption on their part, that there was just one type of spirituality that existed in ancient India, such that they could come up with a convenient term. They assumed that because Christianity was incredibly uniform, that Hinduism must also be incredibly uniform, but they were wrong. And so the term Hinduism ends up housing Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shaktiism, major branches, which oftentimes are in total disagreement with one another. For example, the Shaiva-Vaishnav divide. Anybody from South India here? How massive is the divide between Vaishnavas and Shaivas in South India?
Very large, especially like Tamil Nadu area.
It's just, you can't state enough how averse these communities are to one another. Madhva sannyasis, for example, Vaishnava sannyasis from a particular lineage, when monks, lifelong monks, when they urinate, they chant a mantra that says, "I'm urinating on the Shaiva's guru." In other words, their dislike of this other community is so strong that it's religious. It's part of their tradition going back a long, long time. And who are we to artificially syncretize them just because it makes it easy to study? Sometimes within, just like imagine if somebody was to say, yeah, the American political party, like there's one American political party, like somebody 1,000 years later decided, yeah, I want to teach American politics from, around the turn of the second millennium. And so, I guess the third millennium actually. And so I want to teach, it's 3,000 Common Era, and I'm teaching about American politics around 2000, which is now. And I just assume, well, everybody in the US must have believed more or less the same thing politically, And so they just had one political party, and I'll make up a name for it, like Americanism. And it would be like really rough, because you've now got to take right-wing, conservative, Republican ideals, including the far right. You have to take left-wing, liberal political ideals, the far left, and you have to pretend that those two groups were one group. You could imagine how ridiculous that would be, right? That's kind of what it is to try to teach Hinduism as one thing. Usually what people do is they tell you, oh, Hindu Dharma is, and then they tell you what their particular sect believes, and they say they speak for the whole community. Like there's a newspaper, Hinduism Today. You've heard of that newspaper, Hinduism Today? That newspaper was put out by a white guy who lives in Hawaii, who's part of a really small sect of Sri Lankan Shaivas. Like their numbers are probably like a few 100,000 or something like that. It's a tiny sect. But he put out a newspaper called Hinduism Today and became the voice of Hinduism for, decades. So if you want to make a serious study of Hinduism, you have to get more specific in terms of defining which groups you're referring to. So we are Hindus. We are specifically Vaishnavas. We are North Indian Vaishnavas. And within the North Indian Vaishnava community, we are the Gaudiya community, which was part of a religious revival movement that exploded and underwent a bhakti renaissance in the 1500s. Now, Hinduism is the oldest currently practiced, continually practiced religion in the world. There may well have been older religion, like they discovered the oldest human settlement in Göbekli Tepe, and they found out that in Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, they found that the ruins they discovered appeared to be religious, and so it's just human beings have been doing religion forever. So maybe there's older religion in the world. It's sort of irrelevant, and it wouldn't be possible. Everybody says their religion's the oldest, but it wouldn't be possible to academically trace that out. What we can say for sure, and what you'll find if you look it up, is that Hinduism is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world. But continually practiced doesn't mean it never underwent any revivals or reformations or schisms or changes or evolutions. Those things happened. What it does mean is that there was a core adherence to a scriptural tradition, namely the Vedas, and that connection was never lost. And so as Hinduism evolved through the millennia, it had an anchor point that it had to stay faithful to, namely this scriptural tradition. Remember how I mentioned how Christianity, because of these creeds, it managed to be really uniform? Creeds are very tight, they're small, they're short, they define your belief system in relatively terse terms. They can almost be memorized. It's a short list. And we do have a genre of literature that's like that. But it's mainly medieval. Maybe the sutra literature is like that too, but it's usually pretty difficult to understand. That would go back a few thousand years. But in the same way that Christianity had some degree, an incredible degree of uniformity, because they had these early texts that everybody pledged allegiance to. Similarly, Hinduism is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world, not because everybody believes the same thing, but because everybody has this common core of texts that they have to refer back to when they want to do something new, when they want to carry something on, and those are the Vedic literatures. And they do provide some stability. And you can trace out the evolution. And it doesn't have any... Now, sometimes you'll make a claim that you're a continuation of an earlier tradition. Like Christianity claims that they are the outgrowth of Judaism. But if you look at Christianity and Judaism, they're really different. They're extremely different. Despite the fact that Christianity says, yeah, we continued with their message. If you really look at Judaism and you look at Christianity, they're two totally different traditions. They might have grown up in the same area, but they're very, very distinct. And a good Hindu scholar can go through and show you the evolution of their practice and their belief system over thousands of years. Just like a good South Indian Brahmin can name you 50 generations of his forefathers. Because this stuff's important to them. I mean, if you imagine that. Imagine being able to name your 50 generations of your predecessors. I've heard it done. I've heard it done. It's quite common amongst Brahmins in South India. It's quite common. So you're saying that they can go back 1,250 years and name their fathers and their fathers and their fathers going back over 1,000 years. Similarly, good Hindu pundits, good Hindu pundits can trace out the evolution of their tradition, going back to the earliest source texts and then showing you how it evolved over several thousand years and why the practices they do are rooted in the practices of their predecessors. And where the evolutions took place, where the changes took place. So I want to do a mini version of that for you. If you come to a Hare Krishna temple, we could be defined variously. We could be defined as a new religious movement because the Hare Krishna movement was incorporated in New York in 1966. So we could be a new religious movement. Nowadays, we don't usually get taught as a new religious movement as much, and that's because we are pretty linked up to an older tradition. And so, because our priests and pundits and our practices stay very close to the practices of our earlier tradition, the kind of knee-jerk reaction of considering us a new religious movement hasn't aged well. And as academia has increased its study of our tradition, we've had to end up getting treated as Gaudiya Vaishnavism, because there's a tradition that we're very much a part of that would not be considered to be new. Now, that Gaudiya tradition was a revival movement, which means it was, some people felt that Hinduism had lost its way around 1500. They thought that women and poor people weren't treated properly. They thought that everybody had become too caste conscious. They thought that religion was being used to control people. And they had a Renaissance movement of spirituality about 500 years ago, roughly at the same time that the West was going through its Renaissance and its age of light. They're roughly the same time period, although they were quite disconnected from one another. And there was this group of spiritual savants who decided it doesn't matter what family you're born into and what your level of education is and how much money you make and what sex you are and what family background you come from. None of this matters. All that matters is the caliber of your heart, your love for divinity. And they found this ideal in earlier texts. So it wasn't they were inventing it. It wasn't new. It had been somehow missed because as you routinize a tradition, then you end up coming up with approximations of authority. In other words, you have an initial spiritual movement. Someone is in touch with God. There's a charismatic leader. But then they pass on, and then their legacy has to continue on, and people have to figure out a way to prove that you are representing that earlier charismatic figure. And so then, do you know these verses? Do you know these mantras? Do you dress like this? Do you come from this family? You come up with approximations that don't actually necessarily equate to the spiritual advancement of the founder. Does that make sense? And you routinize the charisma that was originally the possession of the person who had this deep spirituality, but then other people make an appeal that I'm representing that person because I know X, Y, and Z, because I'm from this family, because I speak this language. And then there's a degradation. And in fact, Krishna himself says that there's naturally a dharmasya galani. There's a degradation of dharma over time. Entropy affects spirituality. So then these revival movements come back and say, hey, wait a second, we lost our way. We got to get back to the basics. And we have to get back to the core of our tradition. And a good revival movement can then show you how what they're doing that appears to be new is actually very old. A good revival movement can show you how what they are doing that's different than what's happening right now, they can show you how that's actually the way it was supposed to be done. They're not making it up. If they're making it up and they can't show you how that's the way it was originally done, then they're what's called a schism, as opposed to a revival. Revival means they've correctly understood what the original tradition was teaching. So there was a revival in Hinduism around 1500. In West Bengal, East Bengal, that neck of the woods, led by a personality named Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And it's a big deal. I mean, there's tens of millions of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's followers in the world today. Our religion has at least 1 million or 2 million people, and we're just one small branch of that larger Chaitanya family. And if you go and you include the Chaitanya Vaishnavas, you're looking at tens of millions of people. It's still a relatively small sect, Hinduism-wise, but it's not tiny by any stretch of the imagination. And those Gaudiyas, that's where we get our theology, it's where we get our worship from, it's where we get all of our practices from, our philosophy, our way of life, our value system, our ethics, traces back to this community of revival savants that were breathing life back into a tradition as part of a Bhakti Renaissance. And there's been several Bhakti Renaissances. There was a Bhakti Renaissance a little over 1,000 years ago in South India. In fact, our community, our Gaudiya community, 1500, they noticed that, and they borrowed texts from South India that 1,000, 1,200 years old, and they brought them up to North India and used them to frame out our ideas to show that what we're saying was also noticed by these people, and there was this bhakti movement, this egalitarian movement of teaching divine love as being the goal of the Vedas, as opposed to ritualism. In fact, Krishna himself explains the same thing. Krishna himself, at a certain point in the Gita, towards the end of the Gita, says, Sarva dharman prityajya. Give up all dharma, mamekam shadanam braja, and just take shelter of me. This is, in many ways, a revival movement. You find this in the Gita as well. It's like these bhakti revivals go back thousands of years. And there was one that happened recently that really stole some people's hearts. And we're a part of that tradition. We're a Western outreach branch of that tradition. But then those Gaudiyas, they didn't stay in Bengal. they traveled about 400 miles south to a seaside town called Jagannath Puri. If you view India as being an upside down equilateral triangle, which is a pretty good, gives you a pretty good idea. This portion, the base of the triangle, is the Himalayas that border China and India. And so then on the eastern seaboard, about halfway down, there's a town called Jagannath Puri, which may be roughly equivalent to where Virginia Beach is located in the U.S. Eastern seaboard, small seaside town. Jagannath Puri is interesting because it's not our town. We didn't create it. Navadvip is our town. Mayapur is our town. Vrindavan was so small, it's our town. But Jagannath Puri already had a massive religious thing going on there. The Udiyas, the community of people living in Odisha at that time, already had a full-fledged system of worship in place that goes back to antiquity. And we went there and we merged together with them. And so the Gaudiyas and the Udiyas, they merged together in Jagannath Puri, and we borrowed their tradition and added in our deities of Jagannath. That's their tradition. You'll see festivals like Snana Yatra. That's their tradition. Ratha Yatra. That's their tradition. But then Jagannath is a deity of Krishna, so it's also our tradition, and it fits together perfectly like a hand and a glove with merged together with the worship that was going on in Puri, and it was re-envisioned and understood and commentated on by our tradition. And now Jagannath's big and iconic eyes, they became this, oh no, that's because he's seeing the pure love of his devotees and he's becoming amazed by their pure love. And so much of our ideal, Radha Krishna Prem, came together. And now Jagannath is being taken from Vaikunta, away from Lakshmi, back to Vrindavan. And now Jagannath Puri is Kurukshetra, where Krishna was taken back to Vrindavan. I'm not going to, these are details for the Ratha Yatra lecture we're having next week. But today we're having this Snana Yatra. Yatra means festival. So we're having a Snana Yatra. It's a bathing festival. So, in Jagannath Puri, in the month of Jeshta, which is roughly June, July, on Purnima, the full moon day, in the month of Jeshta, then the deities of Jagannath come out of the temple. And the deities of Jagannath are hundreds and hundreds of pounds each. And they may be over 1,000 pounds each. I don't know the exact weight. Nobody knows the exact weight. Nobody will ever weigh the deities. It's considered to be offensive. Like, we wanted to build a replica of a temple. There's a temple in a place called Karoli. Karoli is near to Jaipur, kind of halfway between Jaipur and Vrindavan, actually. A little off the beaten path, but about halfway between Jaipur and Vrindavan. And so there were deities of Krishna, of our tradition, that were worshipped in Vrindavan. And then the Muslims came. And so then those deities were all moved to Jaipur, which was hundreds of miles away. It's about a 6-hour drive. So I don't know what that is, maybe 250 miles. And so they were moved to Jagannath, to Jaipur. This is in north central India. And that happened because the Muslims were going to break the deities and destroy the temples. In fact, they did destroy temples, but we got the deities out before they destroyed the temples. And those deities took about 20 years to get in there. It wasn't like they could just jump in a car and go. They had to be carried there, and they'd be carried there under cloak of night in a very secretive way. And sometimes these have to be put in a tank of water, like a pond, where wars went on, and nobody knew that at the bottom of the pond was a deity. And sometimes they were carried by hand, or they were carried on horseback or by bullock cart, and it took decades for them to make that journey. And then the king became a Hare Krishna. And he built a fabulous temple for Govinda, our main deity. And he built his palace, so the palace overlooked the temple. So when he came out on his balcony, he could see the temple. And he made sure that on his seal it says, the king is a servant of Govinda. The king is a servant of Krishna. And so there's this huge, the Pink City, this huge city, like a massive city of 4 million people in India. In the center of the city is the king's palace. You went there with us, right? Am I lying? It's incredible, right? And there was 3 palaces, 1, 2, 3, and the king lived in the main one, but then he thought, no, I should give the main one to the deity. So the deity moved in the main palace, he moved in the side palace, and he would look at the deity. And the worship there still goes on today. And the deity moved there, and then, now that worship is there. But it started in Vrindavan. The Muslims attacked. They had to move the deities went there. And then there was a princess, and the princess got married. There was several sets of deities. The biggest one is the Govinda deity, but there's another one, Madan Mohan, another very famous deity of Krishna. And that the princess was a great devotee of Madan Mohan. And she got married to the Prince of Karoli, which is, like I said, is maybe 100 miles away, 125 miles away, something like that. Would you agree? It's about right. And so she had to move to Karoli to become the Princess of Karoli, because she was originally from Jaipur, but she got married to the Prince of Karoli, so that was going to be her future. And she refused to go live with the prince. She said, I'll only go if the deity comes with me. So they actually had to arrange for Madan Mohan to leave Jaipur and go with the princess to Karoli. They had to build a huge temple for the deity in Karoli, and all the priests who served that deity in Jaipur had to move, and now they lived in Karoli for the last couple of 100 years. And that priest was born in Karoli from a Goswami family who worships the deity. He never leaves Karoli. He lives there his whole life. Just like his father lived there his whole life, just like his father lived there his whole life, because their life is spent serving the deity. And we built a replica of that deity at our Gaudiya Eco Village outside of Mumbai. And we went and saw him and said, we want to build it exactly like the deity in Karoli. But he wouldn't let us measure the deity because it's offensive to try to measure the deity. So he gave us the deity's clothes, remnants of the deity's clothes, and then from that we reverse engineered it and figured out how to make a deity. And then he left. He only left twice in his whole life. Once was for a medical reason, I think. I'm not sure. Maybe he went on Tirtha Yatra to Vrindavan. I can't remember. But the other time he came to the installation of that deity in the Gaudiya Eco Village, and he just stood in front of the altar for hours and cried and said, "I can't see any difference. It's the same deity." So we take this stuff really seriously. Like, just our little humble temple. We've done worship, regulated worship, RT 5 times a day, bathing and dressing these every day for 50 years now, without ever missing a day. There was a fire in Laguna Beach, and we got the deities and put them in vehicles and drove them somewhere and drove them to a house and set up a temple at that house, and we did the worship there. We renovated the altar one time, so the deities moved out, they were set up elsewhere, and we continued the worship 7 days a week, 365 days a year. About 25 hours a day of man hours goes into worshiping these deities, and has for as long as I've been alive, 50 years. And so we fell in love with Puri. Our predecessors went to Puri, and they spent time there, and they adopted Jagannath. And therefore, in almost all Hare Krishna temples, there are Jagannath deities that you're going to see in a minute. And those Jagannath deities leave the temple just basically one time a year. It's a couple of weeks, all said and done, but it's basically, it's basically one event that happens every year. They get brought out, and the deities weigh, like I said, 800,000 pounds. So bringing them out is 20 men around the deity, picking them up and moving them slowly, a couple of steps, and then they got this big 75-foot stage they construct, so everybody in the whole town can see what's going to happen. And the town is built around the center. The temple is at the center of the town. So the town was built around the temple. And they get these deities up on this stage, and they have this beautiful bathing ceremony. And they have a special well that they only draw water from one time a year. And they draw 108 pots of water from that well. And they bathe the deity, and it's hot out. And so the idea is it's hot out, and everybody wants to take cool bath, and relax. So we should provide that for the deity also. And the deity has this, amazing cooling bath with 108 big pitchers of water from a special well. And when they draw water from the well, they wear, like the Jains do, they wear some mask over their mouth, like a COVID mask, so they never breathe on the water in that well, and it's just kept for the deity alone. And then they bathe the deity, and everybody in the town can see it. So even if you're not allowed in the temple, some people aren't allowed in the temple, like white-skinned people aren't allowed in the temple, that even Westerners can look from beyond the boundary wall, and they can see because they've made the raised dais for the deity to be bathed on. The Snan Bedi is raised up. And then they dress the deity in this beautiful Gaja Vesh, Hasti Vesh, an elephant outfit. And so you can see it's like a beautiful outfit that's made new every year for the deities, and has a trunk on it and a little horn. And the deity looks like because there's a whole elephant theme that goes on in Puri, because the king of Puri was never conquered by the Muslims. There were certain places in India where they fought, and they never were conquered by and ruled by Islam, and Sharia was never instituted. And the deities of other places that were being destroyed would go to those places and take shelter of those Vaishnava kings who protected them. And so the king's known as Gajapati, like elephant king, elephant lord. And it's an honorific title because he was a very powerful king. Elephants kill lions like that. Elephants kill rhinoceros. Have you ever seen a rhinoceros and elephant fight? The fight lasts about 30 seconds. Then the rhinoceros has that big horn, but the elephant has monstrous tusks, and it's so much bigger, and it just throws the rhinoceros across the field, and the rhinoceros runs away. So there's this whole theme, this elephant theme in Puri. It's a very prominent theme. Anyway, the deities are dressed in an elephant dress. Sometimes they say it's because there was a Ganpati Pandit who came there and loved Ganesh, and he was disappointed that he couldn't see Jagannath as Ganesh, so then they manifested this outfit to please their devotee. And then once the deity's bathed, and for us at our temples, we do it a little different. We've evolved it a little bit. So we don't just let people see it. The deity comes off the altar, and all of you will be allowed to bathe the deity. One time a year. There's only one time a year where we let anybody participate in the ritual. It only happens one time a year, and it's today. And everybody, like if you're wearing, like normally no one wearing pants or a buttoned up shirt is allowed to go on the altar. We wear unsewn cloth only on the altar. And you have to go through about a 5-year austerity process, which involves lifelong vows. We would, no meat, fish, or eggs, no illicit sex, no gambling, no intoxication. You have to do that for a minimum of 5 years, and then take a lifelong vow that you'll do that for the rest of your life, and then also chant for 2 hours a day, and take a lifelong vow you do that for the rest of your life, and then also learn our theology and be trained over a period of years on our altars. But one day a year we just throw out all those rules, and everybody gets to bathe the deity. And then after that, the deity goes into seclusion. There's an anavasara period. Anavasara means inopportune. It's an inopportune time. And so no one's allowed to see in Jagannath Puri as well. They have a picture of Jagannath that they put up so that people who can't see the deity can see that picture. So we do that also. So we're connected to the Puri temple in that way also. And the deity goes into seclusion because it gets sick from taking too long of a cold bath. But then the deities are made out of wood, so at that time they're repainted. Because a wood deity requires to be repainted, so it's an opportune moment for some care to be done for the deity to get them ready for the next year of worship. And while they are sick, then the king's physician, the Raj Vaidya, comes and daily attends the deity and prescribes a diet of fruits and paneer and herbs, Ayurvedic medicines. And the deity eats a special diet for about 2 weeks. In our temple, we do it for 1 week. And then after 2 weeks, the deity comes out, and this Nava Yovana Darshan, this new, beautiful darshan, new, youthful darshan. And then there's the Rath Yatra festival, which we'll talk about next week, because we're doing Rath Yatra next week. So when you look at our temple and our worship, you see this fusing of the tradition from Jagannath Puri, which goes back to antiquity, and the Gaudiya revival movement, because all those saints settled in Puri and made that their place of pilgrimage. This is also similar with Christianity and Judaism. Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish world. And it's also the center of the Christian world as well. Because Jesus was crucified at the Calvary just outside, and he lived and preached in Jerusalem. And so two different traditions came together, and actually they fight over Jerusalem to this day. And then, to make it even more complicated, there's this Muhammad in the Quran went through this thing called the night journey, where he was taken by angels to visit some special places, and then returned back to Mecca by the morning time. And that the place where he went to is identified as Jerusalem by later Islamic scholars. So then Islam went and conquered Jerusalem and took it over. And that led to the Crusades. And the Crusades were the Europeans going to Jerusalem to liberate it from Islamic rule, because Islam had taken it over and thrown out all the Christians and the Jews. And in fact, this happened even recently. Post-World War II, the Jewish people, who just had a third of their numbers wiped out, went back to Jerusalem and took it from the Palestinians who had been living there. And that became the modern state of Israel. So you have these areas which are sacred to different groups of people, and they interface. So with us, we weren't killing each other and fighting wars over it and making land grabs. But our two traditions came together. When you look at the Hare Krishna movement, if you understand this point, our whole tradition makes sense. And some of the stuff we borrowed, some of it we left, some of it we brought from and actually Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a huge figure in Puri. Our tradition going there changed that place forever. And now even for the local people, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has become a saint for them. And they venerate Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And so from both sides, the traditions merge together. And so what does that mean? It means at Hare Krishna temples all over the world, we have Jagannath deities, we have Snana Yatra, we have Rath Yatra, and we're going to be doing that Snana Yatra. It's going to take us about an hour. So I lectured early, and I'm going to cut my lecture short now. And we're going to have kirtan for the next 1 hour. The deities will be brought out. We'll do some perfunctory rituals. Then they'll be bathed in some items, traditional items. We have some ahimsa ghee from our Goshala, where we protect cows in India, and that we brought here for the occasion. And they'll be bathed in honey, probably from our farm. We have bees that don't get killed at our farm. We get honey from them, and some different fruit juices and so on. And we'll do that, and then after that, we'll be bathing them with water, and then we'll make a line here, and you don't have to rush, and everybody gets to come forward, and we'll rinse your hands off, and you just wipe your hands like that, and that's considered to be enough. And then we'll chant mantras for purification, and then you'll bathe the deities, and we'll make a line, and we'll do that, and we'll have kirtan going on the whole time, and then we'll have a big prasadam feast. And then the deities are gone. And that might not be a big deal for you, because you come back next week for the Sunday feast and it's Rath Yatra. But for us, it's a big deal. The deities are gone. We see the deity every day and they're gone. It breaks our heart. It makes us fond for them. It makes us remember how important they are to us. It pulls at our heartstrings, makes us reaffirm our commitment to them, and it provides a really nice stimulus for us to go deeper into our connection with Krishna and feel some intense love for Krishna. So that's what's happening. And you can sit where you are. You can stand up for a moment when we finish and stretch your legs, and then just sit down wherever you want to and get some cushions to be comfortable. And the ceremony will start immediately. Thank you so much. Jai Jagannath.